Kale o Remy, Baoni. Buenas noches, mi amigo. ¿Cómo estás? Welcome, friend. Welcome all to the Immigrant Whisperer Podcast. I'm your hostess, Dr. Janet Awokoya. I was just reflecting on one of my relationships with a dear friend, Dr. Wendy Carter Veal. And she told me many years ago, she said that you can do anything for 15 minutes. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to get back into the practice of reading in the morning and in the evening for at least 15 minutes. So, with that said, welcome to this latest reading of my co authored piece, Demystifying Cultural Theories and Practices Locating Black Immigrant Experiences in Teacher Education Research, authored by yours truly, me, and my dear friend, Dr. Christine Clark. I will continue the reading for those of you following along in the article on page 51, where we are discussing John Ogbu's voluntary and involuntary immigrants. And then we'll move into the culture-centered theory later on in the article. Let's begin. In the United States, with respect to Native Americans, the argument can be made that they played no part in having the geographic areas they inhabited becoming known and incorporated as, quote, the United States, end quote. Their presence in the United States is a result of oppressive forces, such as, quote, slavery, conquest, or colonization, end quote, Ogbu, 1991, page 9, that made them a part of the United States and that forced them to remain here. Ogbu argues that involuntary immigrant students tend to be skeptical and distrustful of schools because they believe that schools seek to stamp out their cultural values and identities and do not offer them the same opportunities as their white counterparts. In response, involuntary immigrant students can develop a secondary cultural system that projects an oppositional stance that rejects the behaviors, characteristics, and values of the white dominant society. On the other hand, voluntary immigrants are peoples who left their home country of their own accord in search of social mobility, educational advancement, and or economic opportunities within the United States. Ogbu explains that voluntary immigrants are more accepting and patient with barriers, e.g., individual and institutional racism, they encounter because they view them as temporary. In addition, voluntary immigrants have a dual frame of reference, which allows them to compare their experiences in the United States to their previous country, often finding that the social, economic, and or political situation in the United States, although sometimes harsh, is still better. Thus, voluntary immigrants are more likely than involuntary immigrants to uncritically abide by the rules established by the dominant culture, including in schools, at the same time that they maintain their own distinct cultures. Gibson, 1988. Culture-centered theory, CCT. Throughout history, debates in educational discourse have engaged four main questions. What is the purpose of education? Who is entitled to an education? What should be included in the curriculum? And how should the content be delivered? Gay, 1994, Howard, 2003, Ladson Billings, 1995. Historically, though, these questions have been answered in varied ways. Educational researchers, practitioners, and policymakers continue to struggle to find unanimous responses to each of these questions, responses that benefit all groups equitably. Of particular challenge in this regard are issues of race and class that often guide implicitly and explicitly responses as well as subsequent reactions to each question. While most educational researchers, practitioners, and policymakers agree that education should impart skills that ensure basic functioning in literacy, numeracy, technology, and active citizenship to all students, educational researchers consistently document that minority groups, particularly Blacks, face institutional, curricular, and pedagogical barriers that impede their abilities to succeed academically. Ladson Billings, 1995. Many of these scholars purport that American education was initially created for and by white, upper middle class males and continues to primarily serve this population. Hilliard, 1984. Others report that in most parts of the country, schools with high numbers of minorities lack qualified teachers, are critically underfunded, and remain noticeably segregated in urban centers and away from the more affluent white suburban schools. Kozol, 1991. In order to improve the academic performance of minority youth, many scholars argue that Blacks, as well as other minority groups, have culture specific educational needs that understandably vary significantly from those of their white counterparts, which require that a non white or better Afrocentric cultural lens be employed to reframe and ultimately correct the problems within the educational system that disproportionately negatively impact Black students. Ladson Billings, 1994. Latour and Kahn, 1999. Ruiz de Valesco et al., 2000. In sum, CCT aims to combat institutionalized racism and eradicate Eurocentric cultural hegemony that has historically contributed to the poor educational outcomes of minority students. Resultantly, culture centered theorists highlight how the disconnect between white dominant school culture and the cultural diversity of racial and ethnic minority students negatively impacts the psychosocial processes, behavior patterns, and academic development of these youth. Gay, 1994. Ladson Billings, 1994, 1995. Lee et al., 1990. By way of remedy, CCT advocates that education be presented from culturally relevant perspectives, encompass varied bodies of knowledge, and encourage students to learn about their cultural selves, their cultural communities, and the world from their own as well as others' cultural perspectives. Culturally relevant teaching is a pedagogical approach that many culture centered theorists have adopted to improve the academic engagement and performance of minority youth. Ladson Billings, 1992. Seen elsewhere as culturally responsive, Darling Hammond, 1997, Nieto, 2000, Nieto and Baudet, 2007, and culturally congruent, Banks, 1999, Hall, 1996, Irvine, 2003. Pedagogy, culturally relevant pedagogues aim to bridge the disconnect between homes and schools by infusing and incorporating students' cultural experiences in all aspects of learning. According to Latz and Billings, 1995, the fundamental tenets of culturally relevant teaching require that students 1. Experience academic success, 2. Develop and or maintain cultural competence, and 3. Develop a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. One of the most important ways that culturally relevant teachers of Black children in particular integrate race into classroom instruction is through the integration of Black cultural interaction styles, call and response, for example, teaching about Black historical figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, and by using texts that include positive Black characters and thus that affirm Black identity. Karunagan, 2002. By consistently including Black research foci and Black cultural representations in the curriculum, scholars and practitioners work against the absence of, as well as the negative depictions of, all historically oppressed and marginalized groups. Critical race theory, CRT. According to critical race theory, CRT, there are two primary types of racism: individual racism and institutional racism. Historically, mainstream U.S. society has viewed and characterized racism only as individually perpetrated acts which cause mental and physical injury, largely through the destruction of property or death, i.e., hate speeches, cross burnings, lynchings, etc. This type of racism is generally easily viewed by others and can be captured and documented through technological means. Institutional racism, however, is a more pernicious, often covert form of racism that is generally less visible but even more destructive of material possessions as well as human life. However, because institutional racism is created and, dear friends, that's the end of this current page, page 51 of the reading. So we'll stop here for today and pick up the next page tomorrow. And please comment below about how you are experiencing these shorter readings of the articles. I'm hoping that it's allowing you to keep up a little bit better. So please comment below, let me know what you think. Okay, people, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. We will continue with page 52 in the next reading. Until then, peace.